Thank you so much for joining us. We're here with Mayor Ted Wheeler and Sarah Iannarone to talk about the mayor's race and get a sense of why you guys are running and why you feel like you're the better candidate. And if we can just start off by having a brief statement from each of you, and maybe Sarah, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share my reasonings for running for mayor of Portland at this time. As you know, our city is experiencing concurrent crises, and they are compounding, because what we're seeing is that the COVID crisis, the climate crisis, the economic crisis of poverty, healthcare that has affected the people who are living in the streets right now is something that we need to address with urgency, with compassion, and as we look at looming budget cuts, increasing efficiency. I have come up with a suite of progressive plans to address these issues. What we haven't seen in the last 4 years, I don't believe, is an intensified deployment of our community resources to address these problems. As someone who's grounded in community, who eats, sleeps, and breathes there, I bring a great deal of community capacity to this work. Also, I bring a global network of urban policy expertise that I believe will help us move further, faster. And it's always about relationship building. So how can we make sure that Portland is maintaining healthy relationships, not only in our own neighborhoods, in the city and region, but around the globe? And so this community-based relational approach is really what I offer in distinction to the incumbent. Furthermore, you know, prior to the COVID crisis, I had released a Green New Deal for our Portland, which was really thinking about the transition for our economy, so that our economy was not dependent on fossil fuels. But then also, prior to the tragic murder of George Floyd, I had proposed a rethinking of public safety. And so I believe firmly that if we were working in tandem with community, realizing these goals, we wouldn't be in 100+ night of protests that we're seeing today. So again, it's this notion that if you're listening to community and operating in community and partnering with community, then we can address our biggest problems more efficiently, effectively, and humanely.
Great, thank you. Ted, can you tell us a little bit about why you're running for re-election?
Yeah, my reasons remain the same as they've always been. First of all, I believe in positive change. I understand we're facing a number of crises right now, but I believe the community is rising to those challenges. I believe my administration has come up with good solutions to complex problems, whether it's the COVID crisis, where we were out early in terms of encouraging physical distancing to bend the curve down, whether it was my administration being the first in the state to put forward economic resources, both to households as well as to small businesses to help them weather the storm, whether it's the community-based demands for racial justice, equity, and common sense police reforms, which my administration has already moved very aggressively on, whether it's the livability issues around homelessness, or even the basic stuff like keeping the city clean and picking up the litter, making sure that the graffiti is abated. My administration has led on those issues. We continue to be a national leader around climate action. The Portland Housing Bureau has never had more success in generating affordable and workforce housing than under my team's leadership. And when it comes to economic prosperity, we rewrote the book. And instead of just doing economic development the old-fashioned way, we're now using a model that's based on shared economic prosperity, whether we're doing development or whether we're encouraging and fostering and supporting small businesses. And last but not least, it's about style. I believe that I have worked hard to bridge the divisions that exist in our community. I've worked well with my fellow commissioners on the city council. I've worked well with community partners to help engage them and encourage their participation on everything from climate to housing to economic prosperity to many other areas. And my team and I want to stick around beyond the end of December and become the first administration, this generation, to actually serve more than 4 years. We want to stick around and keep working through these crises, because I know we're going to get to the other side, and I'm encouraged by our results so far.
Great, thank you. Well, one of the biggest issues these days is the 100 plus days of protests that have taken place in Portland. And why don't we, Sarah, let's start with you and then we'll alternate questions. But I guess I want to find out, how would you have handled the protests? In particular, how would you have handled the destruction that some protesters regularly engaged in, such as setting fires inside and outside of buildings?
We have to look upstream at what is causing the night after night after night of protests in our city. When you go back to the tragic murder of George Floyd and you saw protests erupting in cities around this nation because of the pain caused by racial injustice over centuries here, a great deal of empathy is warranted. Now, that said, what we had at the same time was a budget process unfolding where you had organizations like Unite Oregon and PALF coming with years of background research and community organizing, asking for a $50 million cut to the Portland Police Bureau budget. Now, when they came with that, the city council went a different direction. I would have been more inclined to side with them because I believe that they've done the groundwork on this, that they have come up with the proposed alternatives that they'd like to see in terms of community-led safety, and that we need to be standing in solidarity with our BIPOC community organizations and leaders.
I would like to get into the defunding, but I do want to just kind of just ask in terms of, let's say you inherited this and it's still going on. What is an appropriate police response? What would you do for situations in which people are setting fires inside the Multnomah County building?
I certainly wouldn't be tear gassing whole neighborhoods indiscriminately for the behavior of the minority. This is something that we've heard from time and time again, whether you're in Northeast Portland or East Portland, or even downtown where there are many residences as well, that people, innocent bystanders, whether they're in their homes or out, have been experiencing the negative impacts of tear gas. So it took 100 plus days for the incumbent to call for a ban on that, and even then only in a limited context. I've always insisted that the response to protests about police brutality should not be more police brutality, and that night after night, the police brutality is what begets the protests of the next night. You have to stop the cycle, and I actually haven't seen effectiveness on the part of the incumbent of stopping that cycle. In fact, we have a rogue police force that defies his orders oftentimes. They seem out of control, and it's widely acknowledged in the city, so this isn't just something I'm accusing. This is something that many people have widely remarked on. So the question is, at what point do you say enough is enough and you actually work to get your police force in line? I've committed to putting Commissioner Joanne Hardesty in charge of the Portland Police Bureau on day one. That's what she's requested.
Right, but I still haven't heard an answer to the question about what tactics would you take? What would be, how would you stop that? Would you stop or want police to stop protesters from setting fires in the Multnomah County building?
I believe that if you actually made Commissioner Hardesty police commissioner and that you acknowledge the calls for significantly rethinking the Portland Police Bureau budget, that the protests actually wouldn't be still happening. That's my argument. I'm pushing back a bit on the premise here that we'd still be in day 100 plus of these protests if we were actually listening to and working with the community on these fronts. Again, making Commissioner Hardesty police commissioner would be a huge signifier to the people in the streets who've long been demanding this in their demands, along with their demand that the incumbent resign, which he's not likely to do. But again, acknowledging the demands, recognizing those, and working with the people who are actually in the streets is the best way, I believe, to stop the vandalism, the graffiti, the fire setting, as opposed to responding to that with militarized policing, tear gas, rubber bullets, and so on. That's basically what I'm saying to you, is that I don't believe that we'd still be in this position if we were responding from a more community-centric way, as opposed to, listening to primarily the Downtown Business Association and the Portland Police Union.
Okay, we'll get into Commissioner Hardesty and just what role would be appropriate later. But I will say I don't feel like I heard an answer to that question about, you inherit it, it's day 101 or 105 or whatever. What would be an appropriate action for police to take, and whether you would actually want them to stop people from setting fires?
Of course I want people to stop setting fires. I've said on any front, I don't condone vandalism, I don't condone violence, but the only way that you're going to address what people are concerned about when they come to the streets to protest night after night is through dramatic reforms to the Portland Police Bureau. And when you stop, I arguably think that not having police at protests would stop the violence. We've seen on nights when there's no police response that there's very little violence or vandalism in the streets. And so you have to ask yourself, what incites these so-called riots, and what is the first action that is happening in the streets? From the deep listening that I'm doing, from the talking that I'm doing with people who are engaged in protests from a variety of corners of the city and a variety of tactics, what they want is dramatic reform. And they have not seen it under the current administration. And when they see those changes, again, day one, I would make Commissioner Hardesty, Police Bureau Commissioner. I believe that that would begin to allow the protest to begin ebbing. That would be a direct response that I would take. I'm not just saying that. I believe that that is a tactic that I would employ on day one of my administration to address the situation if I had the opportunity tomorrow. And I believe that it would actually start to make progress in what's happening in the streets.
Okay. Ted, question for you. Looking back at the 100+ days of protests, you've been criticized from people who feel that you haven't done enough to restrain police, as well as from people who feel that you're not taking any control of what's going on. What, if anything, should you have done differently?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And first of all, I want to tee this up just the way you did. I've got folks like my opponent on one side saying that the police have been overbearing, that we've engaged them too much, that they should back off. Then on the other hand, I have the federal administration trying to investigate and potentially arrest me for not having a strong enough response. And my email, my voicemail, it's full every single day with about a 50-50 split. Half the people want me to resign because of too weak a response. Half the people want me to resign because of too strong a response. Here's what I did right, and then I'll tell you what I think I did wrong in answer to your question. In terms of right, this administration acted quickly and with deliberation and intentionality to listen and to understand to what the tens of thousands of people who are nonviolently demonstrating on the street had asked for. And I put together a 19-point plan that I believe accurately reflected what I was hearing from people. It included focusing on non-law enforcement interventions and engaging and supporting the community. It included investing in community. It included investing in non-police interventions like the Portland Street response. It included defunding certain operations that the public felt strongly disproportionately impacted people of color. We elevated equity and inclusion within the police bureau. We enhanced the community oversight and accountability mechanism by referring an historic ballot measure to the November ballot. So the first step was having the community hear and understand that we heard their concerns. Now, in terms of what I should have done differently, I don't believe we had the same degree of deliberation that we had prior to last August 17th demonstrations, where we had two things that really succeeded and the whole world saw the Portland Police Bureau and our affiliated agencies in our community in a very positive light on a day when, frankly, we were prepared for widespread casualties based on the back and forth that we were seeing on the internet and some of the intelligence that we were receiving. We didn't have that last August 17th because, first of all, we built up this broad community coalition where we had 100 different organizations come together and in advance denounce violence as a strategy to achieve political ends. And then on the police side, on the law enforcement side, we had this broad coalition of local, regional, statewide law enforcement collaboration. And the reason we didn't use any CS gas that day, despite the fact that there were large crowds, is we had enough personnel on the ground to create a rapid response team solution so that before anything really had a chance to create a flashpoint, the police were there, they were providing separation, they were de-escalating the situation, and it worked well. What happened with this one that was different, and I don't think we really acknowledged the difference, was the police themselves were the target of the demonstration. It wasn't the alt-right versus Antifa, it was everybody versus the police. And as a result, the police themselves became the flashpoint. And we made a couple of mistakes early on. For the first few nights, we put a curfew in place. And in retrospect, I believe the curfew actually was us drawing a line. And when people saw us drawing a line, they decided that's a line that we need to step across. So we got rid of the curfew. Then we came up with the idea of the fence. And the fence was intended to create a perimeter around the Justice Center that would allow the police and other law enforcement agencies to step back and basically say, hey, this is no man's land within the fence. Everybody stay on that side of the fence, non-violently demonstrate, you can hear, and we'll stand over there. But instead of what happened was the fence became a flashpoint. And so we quickly realized we had to get rid of the fence. The strategy that's worked the best, in my opinion, is when law enforcement is out of sight, inside the facility or elsewhere, ready to deploy if necessary, but out of sight. That seems to be a good de-escalation factor. And that's a formula that I think continues to be my preferred solution.
Why did it take so long to get to that point?
Because we've never been in this situation before. This is unprecedented. I don't know if any city in America, much less the city of Portland, has ever experienced ongoing demonstrations that have literally gone on nightly for months. And so the traditional police strategies of containment, de-escalation, targeted arrests of people engaged in violence or criminal activity, they frankly just have not been as effective under these strategies as we would expect. Prior demonstrations were basically 12-hour affairs. This one's gone on for months. And so it's tapped our resources. We have our law enforcement agencies are burned out. We have other crises around law enforcement that we're dealing with in the community. Forgotten in all of this is the bigger law enforcement crisis, which is around gun violence. That's taken a record number of lives.
And actually, I would like to move into that, but before that, I mean, did you wait too long to ban the use of tear gas?
You know, that's still an open question, and it's still causing problems. So I banned the use of CS gas, and as I've said, I believe you don't need it if you have strong mutual aid agreements and you can recreate a rapid response. I still believe that, but the problem, as you certainly know, being a student of this, is it now has created some potential problems with the Department of Justice and the settlement agreement. And frankly, it may be causing some headwinds in terms of us being able to put together a strong mutual aid agreement. And so there is not a consensus yet between the governor and the folks at the county and myself representing the state police, the county sheriff's deputies, and the Portland Police Bureau on what the right strategy is going forward.
Okay. Ted, you mentioned that gun violence is spiking. The City Council pulled funding for 3 specialty police units, including the gun violence task force earlier this year. Yeah. However, shootings and murders are up, while the Bureau has lost dozens of officers to retirement and resignations. Do you stand by the decision to disband the gun violence team, and how do you assure Portlanders that we're headed in the right direction?
So this is one of those catch-22 situations. On one hand, the public in large numbers, by the tens of thousands, including very prominent people in this city, were demanding us to make a fundamental change to 3 units. They wanted police out of our schools. They wanted us to end the contract with TriMet, or at least let it expire at the end of the year, because there were many people for many years who've been looking at what they believe are clearly disproportionate data in terms of stops and arrests on our transit system. And historically, we've had problem with what used to be called the gang violence team, or gang involvement team, or whatever it was called previously. So we needed to make an act of good faith. We did not completely disband the unit. And in fact, the police chief has had 7 individuals, including a lieutenant and I believe 6 officers, deployed specifically to make sure that each and every gun violence case gets the attention it deserves and the investigative follow-up that's required. I'm coming to my colleagues in the fall bump in a couple of weeks to ask for more resources for the Office of Violence Prevention to strengthen the community partnerships we have in place. So while it's being characterized as we disbanded it, the fact of the matter is we're shifting resources, and we're going to expand resources in areas where, frankly, we were weak before, particularly in the community engagement side.
So what was disbanded then?
What's that?
Oh, what was disbanded? I mean, there was a lot of attention on that.
The main thing that changed was the officers who were on the street on a daily basis, Dalio and others, who are out there on a day-to-day basis, focused narrowly on the question of gun violence and building those community relationships. We are shifting that to go back towards community-based models and having the community organizations that are trusted by people in those communities and are the most impacted be, if you will, the face of the gun violence reduction team and the first to help us intervene. And I think that's an entirely appropriate strategy.
Okay. Sarah, you mentioned earlier about community calls for defunding the police to the tune of $50 million. However, as we were just talking about, gun violence has increased. There are dozens fewer officers, and we're seeing some of the impacts of that with, for instance, a recent story about a 90-minute wait for police to respond to 911 calls about a man with a knife and who had detained or there was a 12-year-old in the apartment for a time as well. Can you tell us what exactly defunding means to you and how you would ensure that public safety is still protected?
Do you think I could have a moment to address the gun violence prevention question too?
Sure.
Because it's looped in there, and I think this is an important distinction. So I've been working with my team and youth actually from across Oregon who've been involved with March for Our Lives for the entirety of their, high school education. Some of them started in middle school and are now headed to college. And so what I did in the past month, especially since we saw the increase this summer in gun violence, is went and listened to them and worked with them and actually put some of them right to work on our campaign, doing research into best practices in cities that were dealing effectively with gun violence prevention. And what I heard from them is they want to see money reallocated and they want to see enforcement of existing gun safety laws. They haven't seen an intense focus from a mayor actually in about a decade on this issue. And so what they're calling for is a bifurcated approach, one where we look at increased enforcement of gun safety and gun laws, but that we also start an upstream approach. The feedback that I get from the Office of Violence Prevention is that it's a very intervention in the moment and even responsive after the fact, but that we need intensified investments upstream. Gentrification is a huge factor here. So thinking about making sure families aren't displaced and that we don't have certain schools, especially in East Portland with high rates of turnover, partnering more with the schools on housing security and identifying families that need securing. So when you talk about defunding the police, what we're talking about is not defunding public safety. What we're talking about is asking the question, what are you afraid of? And what do you need to feel safe? And who will you call when you get it? We know so many of these families can't call 911 when they feel unsafe. They are afraid, especially think of if you're the mother of a Black son or daughter in Portland, what it means to not be able to call 911 when your child is in danger. And so thinking about how can we shore up community resources with that money is really what people are talking about when they talk about defunding. It's not defunding public safety. It's saying we want to redirect resources away from a heavily militarized police presence toward community solutions that shore up youth, families, and communities so that the root causes of gun violence are beginning to be addressed. Because right now what we're doing is putting on a Band-Aid where we need a tourniquet, and it's really securing up these communities from displacement, making sure there's economic opportunities available for our youth, making sure that schools are secure and that we're not having high turnover in our schools are ways that we can begin to address that. So really to get to the defunding question even a little bit more, you think about a good example being the Portland street response. And actually thank you to your organization for the careful reporting that gave us that insight into the huge number of people experiencing homelessness who were criminalized just for that. When you think about the number of arrests in 2017 by Portland Police Bureau, over half or people with a housing status of unhoused. And you think about how, again, can we look upstream at some of these solutions, and increasing funding for programs like street response, where we're having trauma-informed responses to people in crisis, is something that when people are talking about defunding, they're saying we don't want police showing up on scene like they did in the situation of Coben Henriksen last December, where he was shot within 13 seconds of that officer arriving on scene with an automatic rifle, right? But how can we ensure that our responses to people in crisis are humane and that someone doesn't end up dead on the other side of that call?
Right, but there, you still have a question about, you know, for instance, with violent crime, or in this case that was recently reported, you know, many people calling 911 for an active situation with a man with a knife. You know, you know, when you talk about taking 50 million from the police bureau, where would it be from, especially when you have a situation where there's not enough officers apparently due to retirements and resignations in order to have a faster response for emergency issues such as those?
I mean, again, if we weren't having night after night of police protests and all the police overtime with the protests, we would have police freed up to do their actual jobs. This is where I've talked about the fact that we can't come to these, you know, and think that we're going to be able to solve it, you know, once the horse has left the gate. We're looking now at a crisis in which night after night we're having these protests that are drawing down our public safety resources, policing incidents that would be largely, I believe, nonviolent if the police weren't there. And trust me, I've been there and watched, both when the public knows I'm there and also when no one knows I'm there and I'm watching. And what I see time and again is an intensified investment in things like tear gas, quote unquote non-lethal munitions, police overtime, that we could very easily be spending on community safety and other mechanisms to shore up our most vulnerable people. But that's not the decision that our leaders are making right now. They're continuing to respond to protests about police violence with increased police violence. And ultimately, these decisions are what keep us from having the resources that we need to meet the actual needs of Portlanders. It's going to be hard to push me off that square, because I'm pretty firmly dug into the fact that most Portlanders right now don't feel like they're getting what they need in terms of public safety, and we have to have a critical rethinking about what that's going to look like, how we're going to pay for it, and what bureaus need to be reconfigured in order to ensure that all Portlanders can call a number and feel safe when they need help.
So I'd like to jump in.
Because I would argue that long before the protest, we've been low on police. So that's just something that I would follow up on that question with, is this question of the difficulty in hiring and training. And, you know, that was a case for Portland long before the protests.
And Laura, and I recognize that, but that's where you see the street response is saying, if we have half of arrests in 2017 of people experiencing houselessness, why should the response to that be policing? We should have non-militarized, non-police responses to that. And if you're not sending out police to deal with people experiencing homelessness or mental health crisis, then that actually frees up police resources to be used on the types of violent crimes and incidences where their training is germane to the task at hand, and where their weaponry and what they are, you know, carrying in terms of their vehicles and all of their equipment, it is relevant. With someone experiencing homelessness or sweeping people from one end of the block to the other and back again, that's a hugely wasteful expenditure in terms of how we're efficacy, compassionate solutions, and really, does it help us address crime or livability in the city? I would argue that it doesn't. And so if we weren't spending money, you know, on that, what could we be spending it on otherwise, is my argument.
So let me jump in, if I may.
Very briefly.
Very quickly. Okay, first of all, I do not support further defunding of the police, and I want to be very transparent about that. We've already defunded. I called for substantial reductions. I believe it was 24 million as a result of the COVID crisis. Then the city council came in with a substantial amount. I think the total now is about 27 million. Plus, I still need $3.5 million from the police bureau, just as their constraint cut for the fall bump. So there's plenty there. But we cannot deny the metrics that are used to determine whether or not we have adequate policing. And one metric is the number of police officers relative to the population we have. Portland has been chronically understaffed based on that metric. If you do not believe that metric, then there's the question about response time. And we all know that Portland Police Bureau is not responding quickly enough or to the array of criminal activity that we see in this community. And that's also been a constant problem. And I supported increased funding for the Portland Police Bureau. And I'm going to go one step farther and say some of the reforms that the public says they want may actually require additional resources going into the Portland Police Bureau, including, by the way, the gun violence. And also, if we're serious about our Vision Zero goals, the council has been saying for 2 years that we need more traffic enforcement on the streets of this city. That means more police officers. So, and the training that people have been asking for that we put into place, whether it's de-escalation training, whether it is training that helps people be more aware of their biases, implicit bias training, these things aren't free. They cost resources. And so to just arbitrarily say, if we cut the Bureau, we are therefore somehow improving policing, I think that's a fallacious argument. I don't buy it.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. And I believe we start with Sarah on this one. The Proud Boys are planning to come to Portland on September 26th. And as you know, their visits have often devolved into violent clashes with counter-protesters. What would you do as mayor to prevent violence this weekend or for other events like this?
Well, I've been doing it and been doing it since 2017. Since the election of Trump, I've been with my community and standing against the rise of white nationalism, not just in our city, but around this nation. And what does it mean for us as Portlanders to be a bulwark of inclusivity, of diversity, and safe community based in progressive values? We have to tap into the power of community here. I actually would like to say back to August 17th last year, I was there with my campaign. We did an intervention called Tamp Out Hate, where we did a menstrual products drive and collected thousands of hygiene products for people who menstruate who are living in shelters in Portland. Now, the difference between gathering hundreds of community leaders for a photo op and actually engaging them over time in this problem solving, I think is a huge difference between me and the incumbent. What I believe we should be doing, and this is based on meetings with people who are leaders in this, who understand the level of anxiety, bigotry, toxic masculinity that underlies a lot of this, is to make investments in a strong, cohesive community, to educate the public so that we are not divided, but that we are united in understanding that fascism will take no hold here. There is no space for it. Making clear that we will have zero tolerance for it. There are creative things that we could do to bring the community together in line with the Vortex Festival. Many of you may remember that and what it meant to invest in pro-social activities to bring people together in spectacle and conviviality and joy. But we've seen time and again that when the Portland Police Bureau show up, oftentimes these things escalate instead of the community having the opportunity to de-escalate before they get there.
So in terms of with the Proud Boys rally, I mean, are you saying that you don't want Portland police there?
Well, we saw what happened when they came last time. They said, oh, there aren't enough of us. And so you had white nationalists carrying armaments openly in the streets, which was illegal. There were no consequences for that. You saw people with vehicles running them through the streets illegally. I didn't see people being arrested for that. And ultimately, what we could do is even creative solutions. How about a car-free downtown that day? So these people with these huge vehicles who are using them to careen into crowds and cause bodily harm wouldn't even be allowed. Have people on bicycles and riding transit that day. I mean, we have to get creative. We cannot allow the response to this toxicity and this hatred be more violence and toxicity. We need to respond with community cohesiveness. We need to respond with community education and empowerment. And we need to respond by relationship building over time. And I've seen that come time and again, where the same people who are fighting against the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer were actually out in our community last week when the wildfires came, and they were doing clothing drives and food drives and money drives. And you saw that community capacity coming no matter what the threat to our community is. Ultimately, the response to threats to our community is the strengthening of community. And I believe that I have a greater sense of how that can be accomplished and a greater commitment to responding in those ways than the ways that we've done it historically. It's just a different approach, or style, as the mayor would say. I have a dramatically different style to approaching this.
So Mayor, this is happening while you're on your watch, this upcoming rally. What can Portlanders expect? Can they expect that the public safety will be protected?
I can tell you that there are substantial coordinated efforts going on between state, regional, and local law enforcement. I can tell you that the goal, as always, will to be allow people to express their First Amendment rights, but we will be doing our best to keep people separated, groups separated, so that there aren't flashpoints. And if necessary, there will be targeted arrests for people who are engaged in any violence or criminal destruction, to the degree that that can be done on the spot safely. And if not, we'll do what we've been doing, which is follow up with investigative resources. I also want to agree with something my opponent said, but then she disagreed with herself. I do believe community engagement is critically important. And what she dismissed as a photo op actually de-escalated the situation in a very marked way. We had the national head of the Oath Keepers the day after we got all of these community groups together to collectively denounce violence, something my opponent has actually struggled to do until today. I'm glad to see her finally be on the nonviolent train.
That's actually false. I wish you would stop saying that. You need to stop saying that, because it's false. I wrote an op-ed that I've decried the violence as early as May 31st.
Yes, after you failed to answer the question 4 times when you
May 31st, Ted, thank you.
But the more important thing here is the National Oath Keepers decided to pull out. They said, we're not welcome in Portland, Oregon, we're staying out. And they did. It helped de-escalate the situation. It wasn't a photo op, it was a meaningful de-escalation strategy, bringing the community together. And as mayor, you're gonna find that's one of the most important powers you have as mayor, is the power to convene.
Okay, let's see. Ted, we'll start with you. What specific changes in the police union contract are you looking to secure? What do you think is needed for greater accountability?
So enshrined in our city charter is the basic value that we would have civilian oversight of our police. We do not currently have that. We have not had that for a long time, because over a period of decades, Portland city councils have ceded power to the union through collective bargain agreements, most notably around accountability and oversight. And state law continues to preempt our ability to get things done in this city. Sarah mentioned that we should arrest people for carrying firearms. She may be shocked to find out that there is open carry, that it is completely legal, provided you have all of the documents that are required, and that we are preempted by state statute, by our friends in the legislature, from taking any specific actions with regard to those kind of activities. So what I want is oversight and accountability. I'm held accountable for the actions of the police bureau. Therefore, I and the police chief should be able to terminate an officer if an officer is determined not to have been complying with their training and the directives. The final say shouldn't be some guy named Joe who's an arbitrator in Salem. It should be your duly elected officials. And that has not happened. So that is the primary thing that I'm looking for. There's a bunch of smaller things I'd like to see, but that's the big one. If the buck stops with me, then the authority has to be with me as well.
And Sarah, how about you? What specific changes in the police union contract would you want to see?
And I do need to clarify again, I said wielding those weapons, not carrying weapons. I understand that open carry is legal. It's about wielding the weapons. There are people who are pulling the guns and pointing them at people. I agree that the initiative led by Commissioner Hardesty on the ballot this November is a good one and sorely overdue. And I'm grateful to see increased community engagement around oversight of policing, especially as we potentially watch the DOJ leaving town and are thinking about what are we going to do when we're going it alone. So this is a positive, and I'm glad to see that the community power is really making change happen. But it's important to think about how we talk about the police union in Portland, and there's a notion of the buck stopping with me, but then the police go around the me and issue statements out of their PIOs and things like that. So I think there's a bit of false bravado here in terms of what the buck stops with. And that's where community power is going to be important, because it's about making sure that we have community understanding what these negotiations are going to look like, making sure that the community has a say in what the priorities are, and making sure that we're thinking about the future of community engagement, just not in terms of police oversight, but in public safety more generally, and what that process looks like. This should be something that's happening extensively around our city in the wake of the current civil rights uprising. I'm surprised to see it's not happening more extensively in terms of community conversations all over Portland about the future of public safety in here and what that's going to look like. If you look at my Rethinking Public Safety Plan, which we did release last November, it was a sweeping rethinking of public safety here in Portland, and it included some aspects of the police contract negotiation, things that I think we should be discussing as a community, whether we want to think about them. And again, this is why having a community process is important. But what does it mean for us to potentially think about a residency requirement for Portland Police, and what would make that possible for us as a community? What steps would we need to take locally and at the state level? What would it mean for us to think about requiring officers to carry liability insurance is something that other cities are discussing. And so coming to the negotiating table strong, innovatively, and with a full community behind us after concrete and comprehensive conversation about this is something that we should be doing. Ultimately, I think all of our leaders know that we need to have better outcomes for the public through this process, but ultimately it's going to be a combination of those union contract negotiations and other policies. Rethinking the discipline guide is something that I'm hearing from people that we need to be doing in the next contract negotiation process as well. So how can we really look at ways of disciplining officers based on their activities with more clarity is something also.
Okay. I have just one more question on the policing topic, because I do want to cover some other things. But Sarah, you've mentioned that you would give, if elected, you would give the police bureau to Commissioner Hardesty to run. Can you tell me exactly just what are the reasons that, or what are the policies that she's interested, or changes that you think are the right direction to pursue?
Well, foremost, it's because the call is coming from the community and coming from her. As the first African-American woman on Portland City Council who brings decades of experience on this topic. This is her area of subject matter expertise. This is largely why she ran for office, and to leave that capacity largely untapped, I think, is leaving money on the table, really, in terms of what she's offering to do to help our city at this critical time. I also think it's about trust. You know, when you hear the protesters in the streets calling for her to be made police commissioner, when you hear her calling to be made police commissioner, I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to try that and see if something different happened, because obviously when you do the same thing over and over and over again without a different result, trying something new is not a bad strategy. And ultimately making Commissioner Hardesty police commissioner would be something new. She brings a bold voice and a bold vision. I think it would shift the dynamics. It would also leave the mayor free to be more critical. There's some challenges of being both mayor and police commissioner, and so they could operate as a foil to each other. And again, it's just about listening to the community, to our leaders, and thinking about what are some innovative ways we can work to get out of this. Because again, I agree with the mayor that we haven't been in this position before, but ultimately, unless we try new things, I don't believe we're going to get out of it.
So the community was calling for $50 million in cuts, and that was something that Commissioner Hardesty opposed. She felt that there were, she was pushing for the defunding of the 3 specialty units, but that simply calling for $50 million from the Bureau was not being strategic or thoughtful or targeted. So that's one situation in which, many in the community were calling for that, but she resisted that. But you would still argue that that is, I guess I'm curious about just if you think that she made the wrong call there.
I'm not here to second guess Commissioner Hardesty's leadership. Oh, excuse me. I apologize if the dog is a little noisy. I am, I'm not here to disagree with the decisions she's made. The budget process is a political one as well as a moral and ethical one. And I know that there are trade-offs to be made, and I wasn't privy to those conversations. So it's not for me to second guess her reasoning behind that. All I know is that if I were in that process with her, I would have been leaning more into the advising of community and trying new things at this time. And again, we have differences of opinion there, but I still think she brings something very important to the table in this discussion, and it's worth trying.
Thank you. And Ted, you've been asked to give the Bureau to Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Hardesty herself has asked for it a couple of times. Why not? Why do you feel like you're the best person to lead the Bureau right now?
So Commissioner Hardesty and I have had numerous conversations about the Police Bureau. And first of all, I just want to say that she and I have actually collaborated on a great deal of the issues that have already come before the council and have already been approved by the council, including the funding package that we agreed to during the budget process. That was largely, my proposal was 7 million. Her proposal was 12. The council went with the 12, and they had my vote to do it too. So I believe I already stood with Commissioner Hardesty with regard to her budget proposal. She knows, because I've made it very clear, that all of the bureaus are up for reassignment come January. We continue to collaborate. Commissioner Hardesty has some of the public safety bureaus. I have other public safety bureaus. She has the fire bureau. I have the police bureau. So for the first time, we've collaborated around joint budgeting. And that's leading to some efficiencies around administration, the PIO, the budgeting process, financing, tools, IT. So we're already collaborating closely. We talk many times a day. I chose to go a different path with our bargaining around the Portland Police Association. There's no commissioner who's not actively engaged in that. We decided to hire outside counsel. We're having regular executive sessions where I engage all of the members of the city council on the collective bargaining piece. So I guess the only part of the Portland Police Bureau that she does not already have a meaningful voice, vote, and input on is the actual nightly demonstrations. And I'm not sure where she would go with regard specifically to nightly demonstrations that I haven't already gone.
Okay, thank you.
That's a question for her.
Okay. Amy, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. So I have a different question, and that is, you know, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. Portland is a city of small businesses that have been reeling first from the pandemic and now with this latest round of smoke from the wildfires that forced a lot of businesses to have to shut down. The city, of course, is in the second round of granting some of these relief funds that it's received from the federal government. My question to both of you is, what more can the city do to help business owners at this time?
And I think this goes to Ted first.
Yeah, good. Well, first of all, to reiterate, the city of Portland was the first jurisdiction in the state of Oregon to put together an economic impact team. We were the first to get resources out the door. We were the first to put the BIPOC community front and center. In fact, of the first $2 million that went out the door, 90% went to business owners who are minority business owners. We followed that up with a tranche of $20 million of support directly to small business resilience. It's now been followed up by a $12 million grant program. And that grant program is extended through, I believe it's something like 20 community partners to make sure that we are reaching BIPOC communities as well as others in the city of Portland. What else needs to be done? We need to be more flexible with regard to the needs of business right now. For example, we started by allowing restaurants to be able to open on the sidewalk. We've been expanding through the Bureau of Transportation, some of the closed streets, the festival streets, and we're going to continue to do that. We're talking with both restaurateurs as well as venue owners about potential winter solutions that could include heated tents or other strategies. So it's listening. When it comes to downtown, their number one request is stop the violence. Number two, help us pick up the litter and abate the graffiti. And I have major initiatives on the table around those two specific areas, and find a humane solution to get the increased number of people who are camping on our sidewalks off our sidewalks and into a supportive location where they could get the help they need, but not be necessarily right in front of everybody's businesses in the core business districts throughout the city. So those are the things I think we need to do going forward. Clean up the, stop the violence, clean up the city, take the boards down, reopen it, and then work with the business community to either support them economically as we are, or work with them to re-engage those folks in the suburbs or people elsewhere to understand that downtown Portland is vibrant, it's successful, the neighborhoods are vibrant, successful, and we want people to come and enjoy themselves.
And
Sarah, if you're mayor, what extra steps would you take to assist the city's economy?
I had muted for the dog. I'll come back now. This is something that I actually proposed back in 2016 when I ran. So we could argue that had I been elected then, it would already be in place. But an actual officer of small business and entrepreneurship as a central clearinghouse right in the mayor's office to make sure that all of the various activities going on in our city and even in our region were coordinated, centrally coordinated, and that the technical assistance and capital assistance was being tracked and impacts measured. One of the biggest challenges, I think, when you're facing so many crises is watching your impact and making sure that you're having the intended impact from the largest level, even while you're working at the street level. So that's a pretty big distinction between us. I put that back on the table once again, and so there will be, if I am elected, an officer for small business and entrepreneurship in my office that will look then at all the various activities happening in Prosper Portland and Venture Portland and OEN and the other organizations that are working, to the Native Chamber, the Hispanic Chamber, to make sure that our efforts are coordinated, leveraged, and that we're tracking effectively, especially with regard to equity concerns. I also think there's a convivial, again, back to joyfulness and the sense of Portland. I don't often get credit, but for my last decade of work, my job was largely hosting visiting leaders from around the world who wanted to understand better how Portland had made its downtown vibrant in the first place. People who've been here a very long time remember when downtown Portland wasn't very vibrant at all. And so talking through the conversations about the partnerships that made our transit mall revitalization possible, or things like the Halpern Landscape Conservancy, or the other community endeavors where we brought people from across sectors to collaborate on downtown revitalization, is something that I understand quite well. And thinking about how we go beyond downtown revitalization to Central East Side and the corridors is something that Portlanders are very excited to be engaged in. But we need to make sure that we're framing it around what keeps Portland special, and that is enjoying our public spaces, making sure that there's a lot of room for flexibility. I would agree with the mayor on this point in terms of allowing people to have wiggle room, if you will, and making sure that our policies and are also flexible for people trying to get into and out of some of these opportunities that may be only temporary, but they help us engage people in these spaces even while downtown and some of the other areas are closed. I think festivals and other events where people come together, even while we're safely distanced, would be very good. It was very hard on the businesses last week when no one could come out of doors, but I'm hoping to see them on the uptick again, because those festival streets out of the transportation department have been lovely and are long overdue.
Laura, do you want to jump in?
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to jump in, and I believe Sarah, you would take the lead on this one. So here we are heading into another winter in what is the 5th year of Portland's homelessness crisis. I'd like to hear specifics from you about how you would seek to provide more services and shelter to those without homes within our city, and where the money would come from.
Well, ultimately, we need to look at the untapped resources. Back in 2018, I think it was, during the snowpocalypse, we turned the Mount Scott Community Center into an emergency warming shelter. My neighbors and I also built an emergency transitional shelter up in Lentz for women who are experiencing domestic violence. I think ultimately, even though our budgets aren't going to be growing on this, we can try to do more with less by engaging community partners and lowering the barriers to people who want to help, faith-based organizations, nonprofit organizations that want to set up things like we have down in what's affectionately known as C3PO down in Central East Side, which we set up as a response to COVID, but I've long been calling for these temporary transitional camps that have a very limited capital investment of a fence around them, kitchen, hygiene facilities, waste receptacles that give people even one step of greater protection away from the elements and away from the dangers of the streets. I think we could actually deploy those widely. And ultimately, it's about making sure that the public is engaged in the problem solving. For every shelter that I staff, every night that I spend there are neighbors who are there with me. And so it's about tapping into our existing resources in PBEM and civic life to make sure that every single Portlander is on deck to deal with what's going to be one of the hardest winters in recent memory. And we really need an engaged community as our first responder in this economic disaster. And again, it's why I continue to focus on community cohesion, community building, community education in terms of our response to these things, whether it's the white nationalists like the Proud Boys and Patriot Pair, or economic crises, or the pandemic, that we have to invest in Portlanders being able to talk to each other, to work together on these problems, and to engage across sectors in a very urgent response manner, a triage manner, befitting the crisis that we're facing.
Ted, I'll turn to you since I know we're getting close to time. A year ago, you said you were on track to meet the city's affordable housing bond goals, but of course, you could not have anticipated a pandemic and the financial challenges it would create for so many Portlanders. So now, as you consider the economic struggles that Portlanders are facing, do you feel that you remain on track with these goals, and how are you working to step up the city's response?
We will still exceed the promises of the 2016 Portland Housing Bond. The bottom line is, most of that was already underway. We've already got commitments in place. There may be some sort of a gap going forward, but I don't have that information at this point that there is a gap. So until somebody tells me otherwise, I believe we're going full bore towards meeting all of those goals. And I also want to address the homeless thing, because this is an important one. And I was asked up front, what would I do differently about nightly violence? This is also a good time to ask me, what would I do differently around homelessness? So when I took office, we were in a partnership that was a nascent partnership with Multnomah County, the Joint Office of Homeless Services. It seemed like a really good idea because we were pairing the city's infrastructure capacity with the county's human service capacity. So connecting shelter or housing with services that people need to stay successful in that housing. We invested $11 million in the joint office the year before I took office. This last year, we invested 37. So we've become the senior investment partner in the joint office. The joint office has been successful in some cases when we focused attention and resources on slivers of the population, whether it's the veterans population, families with kids, women who are in domestic violence survivorship positions. We've been successful, but we didn't focus the attention that we should have on the chronically homeless, those who are on the streets the longest, who also have coexisting substance abuse or mental health or other issues. We are now doing that. We've opened 2 navigation centers that people are connected to services. We now have navigation teams deployed to go out into the camps and encourage people to seek assistance for substance abuse or mental health issues that need to be addressed. But we've not done nearly enough to address street camping. And I fundamentally do not believe it is a humane approach to allow what we see right now. And under COVID, we're not remediating anything close to the number of camps we used to remediate. So it looks worse, it is worse, there are more people out on the streets. And so I have directed my team to find me resources to open a minimum of 300 new shelter beds between now and November, with the hope that we will actually increase that beyond. We are open to the idea of supported camps, just as Sarah had discussed a moment ago, similar to the ones that we already opened, the 3 we opened during the COVID crisis that have access to toilets, to running water, to support services. We need to do much more. And so we're not only redirecting resources internally in our housing bureau, but we're also looking at the resources, or some of the resources that currently go through the joint office. And we want to work with our partners and encourage them to join us in focusing on the chronic homeless population. But if necessary, the city of Portland will go its own direction, because that's where we need to put our resources. That's where the problem is. And overwhelmingly, this is what we're hearing from the public that they want us to address. They want a humane solution to the folks camped outside on our streets. And I agree with them.
Great.
What makes the decision for you that you pull out of the Joint Office of Homeless Partnership?
If we cannot get the level of commitment that street homelessness is the top priority for the Joint Office of Homeless Services, we've got to get people off the streets. And we've done a great job of opening additional shelters. We are purchasing motels. We are opening alternative camps. We stood up the COVID camps. We opened the convention center and other public facilities. I just extended the Charles Jordan for another several months. That's an additional 100 beds we'll have this winter, but it's not enough. And we also need to work with our colleagues down in Salem. Both of us have talked about the importance of going upstream. Part of the reason there are so many people on our streets is we have a wholly dysfunctional statewide system of mental health delivery and substance abuse treatment. We're near the bottom of the list nationally in terms of resources going towards those needs, and we're near the top of the list nationally in terms of the need for those kinds of services. And so if we're going to solve this problem, then it's going to require not just me as the mayor doing my part, but it's going to require all of us, the county, state legislature, and others, even our federal partners, stepping up and saying mental health services, addiction recovery services, and other services are critically important to us being able to solve the homeless crisis. And while we're way ahead of the game in terms of our ability to create local supportive housing, the fact of the matter is it's not enough. We're going to need a lot more. And so we're looking for additional support from our state and our federal partners to get that done.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And Sarah, I know that you had a hard stop. I'm sorry that we went over by a few minutes. But thank you both for taking time to talk with us about your positions. And we may have some follow-up questions, but we'll call you individually on that. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take good care.